Okay, sounds good. All right, thanks everybody. We have 16 participants online, and that's growing. This is the SWOG Radiation Oncology Research Support Committee. I think we have a whole list of remote presenters. This is our agenda. Dr. Kachnik's going to give us the important stuff in the executive summary, and then Dr. Fitzgerald has about, I think, 50 slides, was it, TJ? So on opportunities for secondary analysis. I think this is going to be super cool, and this is a great idea. I think Dr. Kachnik, this was your idea last month, and then we're going to have a bunch of whole disease liaison committee reports, and if everybody could turn off their cameras unless they're speaking and mute yourself, and I will try and monitor the meeting chat as we go. But without further ado, our executive officer, Dr. Kachnik.
I don't press button this morning.
There you go.
Morning, everybody. It seems like more people are remote than live today. I will say that I think the meeting is moving more to in person again. So I would encourage all of us to try to be here for the fall meeting. So you heard about secondary analyses. I'd like to maybe focus on that for today, not just with Dr. Fitzgerald, but thinking about ones that we can do that might inform new trials. And here, not that these are yet informing new trials, but these are two hot off the press ones. One is a secondary analysis of SWOG 0809 that got published. And this was looking at, and just to remind everyone what was SWOG 0809, it was a cholangio gallbladder phase 2 study that looked at chemo and then chemoradiation for both R0 and R1 resections, published a long time ago at this point. But what the initial primary endpoint showed was that with chemoradiation, the R1s actually looked like R0s, and the R0s were better than historical cohorts. And so this secondary analysis actually showed an effect of lymph node positivity. And just like R1s, those that had lymph nodes that were positive were benefited by the chemo and radiation. And then Dr. Horowitz, who is on remotely, is submitting one looking at the effect of IMRT versus 3D. So here's how one study, even published years ago, has led to 2 secondary analyses. And the second one, done through the surgical committee, actually was looking at how chemotherapy compliance affected outcomes on a pancreas study. And then the imaging committee had a bunch of interesting ones that were talked about yesterday, many on our pancreas studies within SWOG. I also wanted to make mention of, I think many of you got it and some of you applied, about the MAD money. So always a couple of weeks before the meetings, maybe they should send it out a little bit more time before the meetings, but they don't. There's an opportunity to apply for travel grants, and it's called MAD money. And it's pretty easy to get. I think in the spirit, it's really to attract more early career, I would guess probably low mid-level career investigators. But you could always apply and see what happens. The pilot funds. So the new round is coming. I don't know, were anybody here at the first plenary on Thursday afternoon? And so you had an example of someone who had a Coltman fellowship and really made the most of it, had 2 SWOG trials, got an R01, got another R award, and really made a career of it. So I'll start with that one. So the Coltman Fellowship, Dr. Coltman was 2 chairs ago. I guess when my first SWOG was Dr. Coleman, so age me out. But it's for about, I think, 200 or 250,000, and it's towards salary support. So if folks are developing trials, not a bad thing to think about, because you don't really get support for being a PI on a trial, and especially if it's a radiation one that you're doing all real-time QA, you can imagine that you might need some salary support. So just to think about for those that are submitting trials. Now, the other ones, you've heard them all before. They're all due in about either a month or 2 months. The upper left is the pilot grant award. That's $50K, but that's an NCORE one. So this one, it's going to be looking at a health equity question. And then down below is the traditional seed fund. And that's really to think about sort of correlative lab or biomarker research that might inform a clinical trial. The impact award's a big one, and that is sort of a seed award on steroids. So a really large, usually, there's a lot of correlative type stuff being proposed that might lead to a future study. I think the most innovative things right now are thinking of how biomarkers, could even be for us imaging with our imaging and DVH type stuff, how they could inform a question. And for those of you that don't know a lot about the Hope Foundation, it's 30 years old this meeting. I actually gave live. I usually give every year. And I have to say, I don't give to too many charities. I give to our own stuff at Columbia, maybe a little bit to Astro, but I've always given to the Hope Foundation because, what other place does this every year to really support our early career investigators? Not too many. Maybe Astro now. Oops, now there we go. So, think about giving. And then the Hope Foundation is actually calling for board members. It would be great, especially since we are going to be changing out our chairs soon. Dr. Blanky's term is over next year. To think about how you could shape the future of SWOG by serving on the Hope Foundation, which is the sort of purse string for SWOG. And up to what I just mentioned. So last night at the Board of Governors, the PIs of all of our SWOG institutes were there to vote for the new SWOG overall chair. It was a little bit different this year. I'm not sure we only had one candidate or a slate of 2 candidates being co-chairs. So for those of you that are PIs, a couple of weeks ago, they changed the bylaws to allow for group co-chairs. And the folks that applied are a group of our leaders at SWOG, Dr. Lucky Lara, who's our second in command under Dr. Blanky, and Dr. Don Hirschman, who's our NCORE PI. It's still a vote, but the slate's only a pair of people serving together. So likely those will be our next group chairs. And again, that goes into effect, where are we now? I think 2025. Oh, and I don't have any more slides, but was anyone at the 8 a.m. meeting? It's for committee. Well, you were. So we have another opportunity, because there's and I had heard about it, but no one really ever explained it. But we had the NCI on this morning explaining it. So it's called, and let me just look at my own slides on this, the Clinical Trial Innovative Unit. So it's how long it takes to get a trial through? Yeah, everybody, maybe sometimes 15 years. So here's a way that you could do it in a more nimble fashion. So you could apply directly. You could apply through SWOG or Energy or Alliance. And basically, if you have an innovative trial idea, you can go directly to the NCI with it. And the first round, I think, was due July, early July. I know I have it on my photographs. I took off the, they said they were going to send us the slides and we can send them around, but something to think about if we have a really innovative trial from here. It's a 2-page, I did remember this, it's only a 2-page application. So, it's a, as they said, a weekend's worth of work. Maybe not even for us. That might be a 3-hour work. But something to think about. We have a good 6 weeks. If we have a good idea, we could submit it on our own or submit it to Dr. Blanky, who then might have to prioritize from the other committee chairs. Questions on anything?
So that, how is it different from the current clinical trial R1?
Well, that's a great question. So it's, again, this is entirely new, so I can only tell you my take on it. But my take is it removes all those layers of you have to vet it here. You have to vet it through the SWOG executive triage. Then you have to send it to either CTEP or DCP, NCI for review. They send it back. Blah, 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 blah. So even if you are thumbs up to move a trial through, it still really takes 1.5 to 2 years to get it open. So here, the NCI will review it. I guess it sounded like right after this beginning of July deadline. So you would know right away if you're moving it through. And you could do it through SWOG, but you don't have to.
So that's the trial to be opened or designed or written to open a SWOG.
Well, you could, but it sounded like it was open to anybody. Like I could say, I have a trial, Lisa has a trial idea, and I'm just going to submit my 2-page idea to this new unit at the NCI, and they might say, okay. And then maybe I would, if I did that, maybe I would bring it back through SWOG or NCI or NRG, because why not?
Yeah, I mean, this was the first I had heard of it, and the website should be live today, actually, if you Google NCI CTIU. And it was my impression that it wasn't necessarily looking at a therapeutic question, but looking at methods or things that would improve clinical trial enrollment. That was my impression. I could be wrong about that, but so it's kind of not. It's in this like kind of. The NCI wants to accelerate clinical trials accruals and accelerate accrual of underserved people. And so I think concepts that will address that would be more prioritized. So it's like NCI trials, but the CTIU they're looking for innovations in clinical trials. That was my impression, but I could be completely wrong about that. So it's brand new.
Yeah, and with anything brand new, my motto is get in early.
Exactly. Because
people usually don't submit on the first couple of rounds because they either don't know about it or don't know how to do it. So I think if we come up with something, we should just submit it and then worry about what happens if it gets chosen later.
Yeah, it's a 2-pager. Feel free to email either of us or both of us. And it will go through like SWOG committee, SWOG chair and up, but it should be expedited, as Dr. Kachnik was saying.
And then, I should have talked with James, but I was thinking it would be great maybe if we could honor Dr. Decker in some way at our next meeting. I don't know what you might be thinking about, but maybe we pull some money together and kind of donate it to I just donated, but maybe I could earmark the money I gave to the Hope Foundation in honor of Dr. Decker. And maybe we can sort of have a named lecture once a year, and that would support him.
Yeah. And I know Henry Park is helping organize. There's a Yale lecture too. Yeah, it would be great to do one at SWOG because I know SWOG was important too, Roy.
And we could also talk with the lung. I'm not on the lung committee, but maybe that's something we could do together with them, and I'll have you, Henry, be the conduit. Okay.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dr. Kachnik. And you know, the Hope Foundation does have a lot of opportunities for early investigators. So if any of you have early investigators at your institutions, please encourage them to come. And I think there was like, what was it? It was like 1,200 eligible, but only 4 applied or something to one of these early investigator programs.
Oh yeah. So, I mean, I've been reviewing many of them for 20 years. And if we get 6 applications, that might be a lot. I mean, I guess on average, it's about 6. So there's a very high likelihood that you would get funded one of these mechanisms. And again, you know, it could be to support work on a developing trial. I've seen lots of those go through.
Great. All right. And TJ, are you online?
Yep, I'm on, James. Good to
Great.
talk to you.
Yep. And feel free to, if your camera's working, feel free to turn that on. I can advance the slides for you.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? Thanks. Good. Thanks, everyone. I apologize for not being on site. Unfortunately, we did had our own situation where one of our junior faculty died unexpectedly. And so I had intended to be with you, but coverage has been at a premium. So James and Lisa had asked me to look at strategies in terms of being able to use a database that's housed at IROC and potentially TCIA for a secondary analysis. You know, this is a topic I know we're all interested in, and we want to be able to do this at an enterprise level. And I think we've had some pockets of success at in a functional component, but I think we all want this to function at a more robust area and I thought I'd share some information and and share a few ideas with you. So go ahead, next slide, James. Thanks. So just a little bit of background, of the cooperative groups. Each group, has its own member sites, tissue banks, statistics, data management centers, and operations centers. Centrally, the NCI has structured this so that the Institutional Review Board, Cancer Trial Support Unit, functions for all of the groups, and also diagnostic imaging and radiation core services function in that platform as well. The advantage is that when we want to do secondary analysis, you can draw upon data sets from multiple groups, and as particularly if we're interested in, let's say, normal tissue endpoint, drawing data from multiple groups actually may help secure our analysis of that and make us feel more confident in the outcome. So the current status is as you see, and the reapplications will be coming up in about a year or so. And I don't hear any new news about the IROC component changing. So I think will likely still remain a centralized function. So next slide. So if you look at our website, if you look at the left, you'll see the various NCI groups that we support through the IROC Center, and at the Rhode Island group, I work with the majority of groups, as you can see, with Alliance, COG, ECOG, ECTN, PBTC, and SWOG. On the right, I actually support a variety of industry trials as well. And this also is a portfolio of data sets that are available to you. Currently supporting a trial of over 1,000 cervix cancer patients worldwide for immunotherapy and RT. All have PET staging and brachytherapy. So there are a variety of trials, various lung trials, and essentially all disease sites are identified within the industry trials. So this portfolio is broad, robust, and can be repurposed for all the objectives that all of us want. So next slide. So the mission is to provide integrated radiation oncology and diagnostic imaging QA programs to support all of our objectives for the NCTN. And it really enhances the quality of data to not only improve outcomes, but to give us confidence in our secondary analysis moving forward. We do have a worldwide base, so it's an important footprint for all of us to study from. So next slide. So the core services, for the radiation oncology side, as you're familiar with, includes site qualification, which includes facility documentation, TLD visits, and various important resources, trial design and support. So when you do have the concept sheet, we can work with you to be able to design it in a manner that would be compliant with CTEP objectives. Credentialing are really often a series of knowledge tests, and we do this in industry as well, just to be able to make certain that contours can be done and data can be transferred in a seamless manner. We provide the data collection and data acquisition processes, including review of the data to make certain it's protocol compliant. And then I do individual case reviews, most of which is now pre-treatment, where I'll have the imaging that you use to contour, as well as the treatment plan, to make certain they're protocol compliant and that the compliance objectives for both tumor coverage and normal tissue constraints are met. And this gives us an opportunity to facilitate, the acquisition of any missing component of data. On average, during an initial submission, half of the data may be incomplete, but after that initial review, 99% of the data that's required, for case review is able and fully on site. So this provides a mechanism so that you're assured that there's enough information on board that we can do not only the primary support, but the secondary and tertiary support that you want to do in order to ask more sophisticated questions that we didn't anticipate at the time of trial design. So next slide. So in the database that we view, as our discipline has become more image driven, we've constructed in a way so that imaging and the RT objects, sit side by side symbiotically in the database, so that the images we acquire is the same data set the diagnostic radiologist would use, let's say, for an adaptive trial that we use, for construction of target volumes, so that the radiologist and radiation oncologist really sit shoulder to shoulder in a virtual manner to be able to achieve the objectives of the individual trial. So we look at it as a complete case management system, and I'll show you a few examples. Next slide. So within the archive, we have over 400 protocols dating back to the mid-1970s, and you can see the variety of protocol cases on site. The advantage we have is that the cases have all been reviewed, and the treatments were executed in a protocol compliant manner, so that when we do want to do secondary objectives for tolerance, you can be assured that the objectives of the trial were met, particularly as we start to look at extreme events and toxicities, as well as tumor control. We've also been able to support a number of people to do secondary analysis, and the photo you see below is Karvita Devanjan, who at that time was a Memorial Sloan Kettering resident who came up to look at a pattern of failure analysis on a Hodgkin's trial, which I'll show you in a minute. So next slide, James. So when I acquire the information, bottom left, you actually, see the target left lung. And for most protocols, I have all the anatomic and metabolic imaging components. And then we have all the radiation therapy objects within that, as well as the objectives for the study. So you'll see this synergistically displayed side by side in the database. So next slide. this particular case actually didn't meet protocol compliance because there were constraints for both lung, rib, chest wall, which I was able to address in a pretreatment review to, as you see on the right, for protocol compliance. So the ability to do real-time review gives us the opportunity to, to at least apply objectives of the trial in a synergistic manner, and it gives us that opportunity to assess toxicities moving forward. An important step in in trial design, particularly when the institutions participating are worldwide in nature. So next slide, James. We have the DVH criteria there on site, and you can also recalculate it through a variety of formats that we have on site. And if you had a tool that you wanted to use on your own site, the data is available to download in an anonymized fashion. This is available at your fingertips to be able to do secondary analysis. So next slide. So what I wanted to give you now is a few examples of how we've been able to repurpose the data. And as our colleague Larry Baker said, that trials that we all participate in give us really the best opportunity to demonstrate that we have evidence that medical progress has been made, and the fact that we all work together, we can make the whole greater than the sum of the parts by increasing our fund of knowledge. And within this, there are countless collaborative opportunities, and the trial results will help us move our field forward with respect to many issues in terms of tumor control and normal tissue tolerance. So next slide. So we took a series of trials and evaluated the question of whether or not the compliance to trials improve outcomes. And we can't demonstrate it in every trial that compliance improves outcomes, but by far and away, the majority of protocols have demonstrated that compliance does lead to decreased failure rates, improved survival, and it contributes to our ability to answer the central trial question. And I'll give you some examples where that came into question. So next slide. So the PAGA 8725 was a trial that today we would score as being intermediate and high-risk patients. And these patients were given either chemotherapy alone or chemotherapy and radiation. And the initial publication showed that there was no advantage to the radiation, which was disappointing at one level. Excuse me, but I went back and did a secondary analysis, and if patients were treated to the appropriate radiation therapy volume designed on that trial, there was a survival advantage of more than 10%, and this was statistically significant. So this was an important step. Now, this trial, the QA was only done in retrospect. So the images were collected, RT data collected, but we didn't have an opportunity to intervene. And with this information, Sharon Murphy at that time asked the question of whether or not we could move this forward in more of a real-time process. So next slide. So this next iteration of Hodgkin's trials were 9426, 9425, and 9426 was an early stage protocol. And it asked a very interesting question of 2-cycle chemotherapy, 21 gray RT to involve fields. And the strategy applied to that was to see in favorable patients could we titrate therapy. So I was asked to review all the radiation data in real time, before patients were treated. So we collected all the images, and the RT was intervened pre-therapy. And we showed that we were able to decrease the deviation rate from actually as high as 30% to less than 10%. And we were able to publish this in the trial. Actually was highly favorable to titrated therapy. However, John Williams was the diagnostic radiologist assigned to the trial, and he reviewed the images in retrospect. And much to my surprise, he disagreed with the central review of diagnostic imaging over 50% of the time. So this became a very interesting secondary analysis, in terms of moving forward. But this allowed us to reach a conclusion that not only did it help to move the radiation therapy compliance structures into a real-time format, but it also made a difference for diagnostic imaging. So next slide. So this led to 0031, which is an intermediate risk Hodgkin's trial. And the schema was such that patients were treated with 2-cycle drug, and then whether they were a rapid or slow early responder was validated, at IROC. I actually did all the reviews, and if someone was a rapid early responder, which was the majority of patients, they then went on to 2 more cycle of drug, and then there was a secondary randomization to radiation or no radiation. If there was a slow early response, patients went to augmented therapies and then involved field radiation. So within this trial, the real-time review of objects was done at multiple time points, not only for initial response assessment, confirmation of clinical response as defined at that time by metabolic and anatomical imaging, but then also compliance to radiation. And as you can see, there were almost 1,800 patients on that study, multiple data sets within that study, of which we've been able to publish many secondary analysis, including response in bone, response to pleural effusions. And so it's not only radiation cohorts, but also cohorts in diagnostic radiology. So it's an extremely rich data set with metabolic and anatomical imaging and all the radiation, field design, available for secondary review. Next slide, James. So this has led to a series of publications. I actually was asked to write the editorial for the advanced stage French trial in Lancet Oncology about how to optimize adaptive therapies, because in that particular trial, in high-risk patients going to more augmented chemotherapy with Mbeacot, they actually had an improved survival over those that were slow early responders in 0031. Who then got initial therapy, but then the augmentation occurred at cycle 3. So it was an interesting, observation between those 2 studies. And then it also gave me an opportunity to write a paper on differences in treatment paradigms between Europe and North America. So next slide. So we were able to do a secondary analysis with Carvita, who was a resident at that time, Memorial Sloan Kettering, and look at patterns of failure on that study with the image sets. Because one important thing, and you'll see a few examples of this in a few minutes, we do collect all the outcome imaging in COG. And that's been very important in terms of not only assessing outcome, but differentiating some potential missteps in secondary analysis. What was interesting in this paper, which was published in the Red Journal, was that both reviewers actually had the same comments, that the effort in, for clinical trial research and the value of radiation therapy protocol review was both reviewers felt was validated, and also demonstrating the importance of physician education in this regard to limit protocol deviations was also thought to be important. And it spoke to the commitment of everyone involved, and that's all the site investigators as well to participate. And it also implied that the success of this would give confidence that future trials using the same formats could be undertaken. So I think with studies like this, we have confidence in the outcome. And having these processes in place for real-time review and data collection and data storage gave us a chance to really expand this into a variety of cohorts, including the use of brentuximab in this setting, subtotal volume radiation therapy in the advanced stage patients, where in those protocols I would have to assess response and then assign what should be irradiated based on response. So it gave us an opportunity to ask different questions. Next slide. So one of the reasons you want to collect all the data and have it all available up front is that, you know, it was demonstrated in 9961, which is Jeff Mahalski's standard risk trial, where he looked at dose and volume titration, you know, for PD medulo patients. You know, it took 189 institutions to accrue 421 patients. And as you can see, more than 10% of the patients on retrospective review of imaging were deemed ineligible. And, you know, and the feeling was that we could do better. And you can see that the majority of patients were excluded because of either residual disease in the posterior fossa measuring greater than protocol standard, or evidence of metastatic disease on spine imaging. In the bottom right, you see the challenge of this, because if you look at those patients that were not protocol compliant in the study, the survival was significantly worse. So that's why it's important, if we want to answer questions, that the database itself and the patient population be consistent. So, and we were able to publish this as part of Jeff's portfolio. So next slide. Now, collecting all the outcome imaging has proven to be very important. As you can see on the left, there's a patient with a medulo, which, you know, fills the fourth ventricle, you know, unlike ependymomas that tend to wrap around the brainstem and can enter the foramen of Luschka. Medullos tend to stay at least within the posterior, within the fourth ventricle. But the outcome imaging, as you can see, demonstrated an abnormality in the brainstem. And this was important because at that time, people were asking different questions about proton therapy, and was the risk of potential brainstem necrosis more prominent in protons versus photons. So this case, and the one I'll show in a minute, were actually scored recurrences in the SWOG database. So because the NCI had asked me to go back and look at these issues, I was able to pull all of the cases up because I had all the outcome imaging. And over a 4-month period of time, was able to create a portfolio of cases that likely were not recurrent disease, but more consistent with brainstem necrosis. So next slide, James, will show you the treatment field. And if you go to the next slide, it's an example of another case where, again, you see the brainstem necrosis, is evident. Now, very interestingly, all of these abnormalities occurred in the basilar artery segment, which were really where, when, as you all know, when you track the arterial supply back to the brainstem, it's somewhat limited, so all of these cases really had the same image, radiomic features. And we were able to put all of this together into a single portfolio. Now, long story short for everyone, this turned out to be technique and therapy agnostic. In other words, this was not accelerated in the proton group, so there was no acceleration of necrosis, secondary to the Bragg peak. And it was important to have this. And so we were able to pull this together as an NCI white paper to move this forward and kind of take away that perception, which was important because this was at a time we were asking questions how we were going to introduce protons into clinical trials. And it was good to have this data available. So the next slide is the field design for this case. Now, parenthetically, I'll say that what was interesting, Jeff's study did show we could volume titrate for the standard risk patients, but not necessarily dose titrate. But I'd say as part of this trial, I had a case that actually had did a very good IMRT carve out of the brainstem. So at the time this protocol was active, unfortunately, we had to score that case as a deviation. Today, you might have called it prescient. So that's the reason you want to have all the data on site. So next slide. So there are opportunities lost in breast cancer. There was a wonderful group of clinical trials, that the then CLGB had in node positive breast patients, and this goes, where Larry Norton did a wonderful job not only introducing Adriamycin with Craig Henderson to patient care, but then brought dose dense therapy into question. And then in a third study, brought Taxol into the equation. The assumption at that time was that collecting radiation data was not going to be important to the trials because the feeling was that we didn't impact necessarily patient outcome in relative to survival. And then the next slide, of course, is the one we're all familiar with, where we did show a benefit to survival. And, and next slide actually is one that, at that point, because there appeared to be an impact, I was asked to go back and see if I could call data together and to see if we could then work at seeing if dose and volume could somehow be correlated to these issues. And unfortunately, Larry Schwartz touched on this yesterday as well in the imaging meeting, of the nearly 4,000 patients on those three trials. I can only get data on about 1,000 because going back to, reconsent and such, institutions had various policies on this, all of which have become more and more rigid as time has matured. Carolyn, tried to go back, and all we were able to show at that point is that the patients that were irradiated were ones that had received Taxol. So, the impact of Taxol was brought into question as a result of this paper, but we couldn't carry the data much further as much as we would have wanted to. So I could make no comment on local regional control at that time based on the data that we collected. Next slide. So we still have current problems with axillary management, as this group knows, because if we did have data from that experience, we may have been able to help some of the upcoming trials, including Z11. So next slide. As this group knows, Z11 was designed to really look at therapeutic titration in the axilla, with the assumption that tangential fields would be reasonable enough to treat, at least by default, some axillary volumes. And so after the trial was published, I was asked to do the QA, but I was not asked to collect information other than whether or not the patient was treated. So I had no images or field design, but I did have completion summaries. So Reshma was kind enough at that time to work with us to take a look at this. And what she was able to demonstrate from the information that we had was that a high percentage of high-risk patients actually had supraclavicular treatment. So it actually challenged, the primary endpoint of the study. And so again, an important point that if, having all the information up front and understanding patterns of failure, we could have answered the question, I think, in a potentially better way. So next slide. So as this group knows as well, with 0617, where was the trial we're all familiar with in our lung cancer, groups that really looked at dose and chemotherapy. And but what sometimes is not acknowledged, is that for the first 3 years on the study, the high dose arm actually had statistically significant worse local control than the low dose arm. And the important point is that images were not collected on that study. So we really can't validate was tumor excluded, which is one of the questions that we have to ask. And if in the first 3 years on study, if that didn't occur, would the results have been different? So it really brings us to the point of how important image collection is when we want to answer important questions, because the outcome of this trial has influenced almost every industry trial moving forward. And we have to always stop and pause and realize, did we do, could we have asked the question a little differently, or answered or achieved a different outcome if the images were collected as part of the study? Because the only thing that we have are the radiation data sets, and not the images that would define how the contouring was done. So next slide. So it brought us to the point of where with this, I acknowledge this, and how moving forward, a large portion of QA was going to have to be done with our imaging colleagues. And we really stand shoulder to shoulder with the radiologists in terms of helping us define targets. And, and I think this has become a crucial component to clinical trials. For SWOG, I do collect all the imaging with the radiation therapy treatment field. So you have all of that at your fingertips. It's, it's available for secondary analysis. So next slide. For those that are less familiar with the head and neck trial we ran, this was an industry trial I did, but then Sanofi, looking at the tirapazamine randomization for head and neck cancer, because Lester Peters's group had terrific phase 2 data showing a potential advantage to adding hypoxic cell sensitizer to head and neck patients. The challenge was really managing the QA for the radiation therapy. And if you go to the next slide, James, you can see on the left that there were over 216 patients that I had asked for adjustments to be made. Now, the trial committee included, some worldwide members, not only Lester, Brian O'Sullivan, and Jordi Geralt from Spain, and they asked me not to do the review in real time, because it was a worldwide trial. So I was asked to do it during the first week on therapy. And so if you look on the left, if plans were compliant, that's what you see in green in terms of survival. The ones in white, interestingly, were those 96 that actually made an adjustment that I requested. So they may not have been fully protocol compliant for the first week. I mean, you can see, at 3 years, the survival falls off. What's in red is that there were more than 25% deviations on study, because 116 of the sites, or I should say the patients that I had requested changes, didn't occur. But I was asked by the trial committee to go back and devise my own strategy as to whether or not the deviation was meaningful. Because there are times contours are too close to skin, so you don't get 95 coverage, issues such as that. So in red, interestingly, were those deviations that I felt were not clinically meaningful, and in blue are the non-compliant patients. So you can see the discrepancy, and unfortunately, the deviations overrode the randomization to the study. So our limitations in quality assurance on this study on the RT side overrode the randomization, even though radiation wasn't the primary study point. Next slide. So this gives you a sense of the portfolio that we have. It's really broad and robust in the number of diagnostic imaging sets, and this is just a snapshot. The database is more robust. Next slide, James. So I thought I'd give you a quick tour through TCIA. There's a real interest in RADOC participation in TCIA in terms of what Fred Pryor and Joel Saltz have been able to do with DICOM acquisition of objects and Joel's role as a digital pathologist. So next slide. So TCIA has data collection centers, data sets, access tools, and data analysis centers. Fred was originally asked to collect data, but he's been able to build a strong portfolio that you can actually upload directly into TCIA, download from TCIA. And then he's also added a portfolio of data analysis centers. And eventually we want to add radiomic features into this for both diagnostic imaging and radiation therapy. So next slide. So, just, give us an opportunity just to browse individual, collections. So you can browse, search radiology, search pathology. REST API is your ability to have interfaces to upload, download, and then you have data analysis components. Next slide. So when you log on, this is what you see is a variety of data sets available. And in a whole list of formats that's linked to a variety of databases. Next slide. And the portfolio becomes, pretty, very robust, and just browsing the data collections is a good place to start. But as you can see, radiation oncology is not as well represented. So the downloads, you can see you pull down individual images and full data sets. So next slide. These are the pathology data sets that coexist within the portfolio. So next slide. So when you click to the data analysis centers, there are tools that can manipulate within the individual data sets, and which will allow you to actually start to analyze and pull data from one data set to another. So next slide. The categories are pretty robust individual tools you can actually install yourself on your own hard drive, and various components of TCIA allow you to code share. And there are third-party services that are agnostic and open source. So next slide. So there are various tools that allow you to download into your own setting. And one is 3D Slicer, and different individual tests that allow you to bring in some of the cloud technologies for moving objects back and forth. So next slide. And the archive itself can link directly to your PACS system and de-identify objects as institutions want to upload. We actually have a way within IROC to be able to upload directly into TCIA once permissions have been obtained. So next slide. 3D Slicer allows you to bring objects directly into your own hard drive to be able to use for tools. So next slide. And the integration components with PACS are at your fingertips as well. So next slide. in the community, code sharing is robust. So this allows for various data analytics, and eventually more and more radiomic tools will be incorporated into this for common use. So next slide. Now, if you look at the one database itself, go ahead and go to the next slide, James. So you pull this up and all the information's at your fingertips in terms of genomics, proteomics, imaging, pathology objects, because these objects are all now DICOM compliant. And the RT objects is really one of the objectives Fred and Joel has asked me to incorporate. So next slide. So, TCAA plays an important role in the expandable commons cloud. And go ahead with the next slide, James. And you see where the archive fits into the imaging data. And by default, because pathology objects are now DICOM compliant, we move forward with that as well. So on your left, whether it's a tool algorithm developer, computational scientists, any of us, different biologists can work our way through the NCI data commons through, through these inputs. So next slide. So TCAA does support a variety of research initiatives, and we support it as well. So next slide. Right, and these are some of the community proposals that we work with on a daily basis, including challenge competitions and, and publication data sharing requests. So next slide. So the scientific impact is very impressive. Actually, over 20,000 people a month access TCIA, and on the bottom right, you see a list of publications that have been generated from TCIA, with Nature, PLOS ONE, Medical Physics, and others being very prominently displayed. And go ahead and hit the next slide, James. And the NCI has now designated TCAA a high value asset. And one of our objectives is to try to work symbiotically with TCAA to at least have this data available. And I'll touch on some of the challenges at the end. So next slide. So if you have an idea, you can submit it for, and if you have data, it can be entered through a curation support mechanism. Next slide. What Fred Pryor has established is just a data submission agreement that you can use, and it's a straightforward process. So next slide. So as you think of TCAA, there's such a wealth of data, within the archive itself. And in many ways, it functions like I like to think of it as an epic medical record system where you have curation, data download, DICOM services, clinical data services, pathology, publication support. All of this kind of functions individually within its own box, but the boxes are all linked together through a series of interfaces with a front end gateway that we move in data in and out. So next slide. So the pathology and radiomic data are now working synergistically with Joel's support. So you can see an individual lesion and and then the pathology database below. Joel has done quite a bit looking at tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, and this has been a great addition to the portfolio. Because he can look at various integration components, through this mechanism. So next slide. And what Joel's developed is a way to actually subset different infiltrating lymphocytes, through various components that he's been able to apply. So next slide. The harmonization of common language is crucial, and this has been a real strength of TCAA as you upload data, and so it's a modified form of AI that can actually pick individual data sets to be able to upload and store TCAA in data in the appropriate component. So next slide. So the curation to you submit, it actually goes through a filtration process, so it can be uploaded and stored in the correct location. So next slide. So individual institutions have actually taken PRISM, which is the backbone informatics infrastructure for TCIA. So whether it's pathology, radiology, different elements in terms of the data acquisition language. Fred's been very good about just allowing institutions to actually use the infrastructure for their own use and repurpose all of this information. So next slide. So so this past year, I was awarded a supplement to be able to help support SWOG, committee members for secondary and tertiary data analysis. The supplement was $80,000, and what I did with that was, provide a modicum for data analysis support, but also support the use of a statistician who is Bruce Barton, is someone that I work with at UMass. But the objective was to do what you want. It was to really take the archive, the data, use it and repurpose it, because to date, we've had success in publications of secondary data, but I really want this to move to a full enterprise function where everyone has access, the data can be used, and it would thrill me to no end to publish a paper a week with all of you to just, use this information and move it forward. So the objective was for 3 papers, looking at the National Wilms Tumor Study, relapse patterns of care study, QA parameters for CNS disease, and outcomes for patients treated on the various rhabdomyosarcoma protocols. We've been able to use this to be able to create a bit of an infrastructure, which I'm hoping is preliminary data for an application all of us can write to really make this a robust service. So next slide. So I wanted to touch on some of the challenges, that we've all found, so far is that I think we've been successful at generating secondary trial objectives, but I think all of us realize that we want this in an enterprise function as something much more robust than let's say I currently do. Right now, through the funding mechanisms through IROC, we're funded for service, but Meg Mooney, even in 2014, made it clear that, oh, you're not going to do research, are you? And I said, well, yeah, we're going to. That's what we want to do. So what happens is that I wind up repurposing, many of the individuals that I work with to be able to achieve these secondary objectives. But we've done it at an ad hoc basis, but it's not being done as a routine. And I want to move this to a routine structure so you could tap into it and we can get an outcome in a timely manner. Days and weeks versus months and years is where I want to be with this. Because at the moment, the research does require investigator time. And unfortunately, it's been self-supported because, the grants are designed for service. And I want to change this as best I can. It's, it's important in SWOG. I think we're grateful that we have Lisa in the position that she's in, because she can help navigate processes for permission for data review. It really varies between the groups, and I'm actually having challenges in SWOG right now, getting the data for the 3 projects that I want to use. The NCI believes the data is public information, but when you start to scratch the surface with the individual groups, there are layers of responsibility, largely appropriate in terms of data security and repurposing this information. In some groups are more restrictive than the others. And, I'd like to have a group conversation about this so we can make this a real resource for everyone to use. because within the groups, they do place emphasis on current trials and the primary endpoint. And after the primary endpoint is established, the groups tend to move on, but this wealth of data is sitting with us that can help move us forward. TCAA has some of the tools, but what's happened is that it takes time. And what I would like to do is find a bridge component where I feel a responsibility to transition data to TCAA, but the time that it takes often goes beyond what us as investigators want to use to study a secondary or tertiary endpoint. So we need a bridge between this where we're fulfilling both objectives. One, getting data to a public archive that can be used, but at the same time, having the ability to, in the nimble processes in place to use this data in more of a real-time format. Our clinical trials are adaptive, so we can use this data in an adaptive mechanism. And one of my goals is to eliminate those barriers. And I think what it's going to do is require another grant application, one that takes the data that we have, and it says, okay, with this data, it's now my responsibility to break down the barriers within the groups, but have the data available so that all of you can use it in more of a real-time basis, and then bring in some of the data analysis tools from TCAA to allow these things to occur. So I think moving forward, there is an opportunity. I think we have to seize the moment, though, and I don't think it's going to come necessarily through, let's say, the IROC renewal and such, because Michael and I had a conversation with the NCI on May 1st, and to be honest, it was a little disappointing because I got the impression that in the renewal, they want more of the same, and we can do that in that service, but that's not really where we want to go. So I think I welcome all of your ideas, but I see the need to kind of move this on a fast track so that you can use the data that you have at your fingertips in a real-time manner. So James, I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, TJ. So I think we have a time for maybe one or two questions, but it sounds like you just made a call for a committee member to write a grant to leverage the TCIA with you. Dr. Ha has a question, actually, so that folks online can hear. You don't mind using the microphone.
Hello, TJ.
Hey, Joe, how are you?
Hi, how are you? A fascinating talk. Really appreciate it. Something that caught my attention is you mentioned a POG protocol, where the diagnostic radiologist disagreed 50% of the time. I was wondering if this is something that involved a unusual situation, or do you remember how this happened?
Sure. No,
is it something you got to worry about, or?
No, I think, Joel, here's my take on that. That protocol predated our ability to use metabolic imaging in a nimble manner. So this was largely based on anatomical constructs because that's the way the protocol was designed. And therein lies the limitation, because you and I can look at the same thing and measure it differently. Mm-hmm. And that's really where the discrepancy came from. However, they were meaningful, and the analysis that I actually want to do on that study is to go back and say, did it make a difference? In terms of the way I measured versus someone else and what the outcome was. What I can tell you all is that the outcomes on that trial were so good. With titrated therapy in favorable patients, the survival at 10 years, and this data was kept under lock and key because it was going to make a very prominent statement that, with 2-cycle 21 gray, 95% survival. So I suspect if you and I went back, and this is the reason we haven't looked at the imaging data, because the outcomes are so good, the suspicion is that if someone was supposed to have a 50% response and their response was 45, did it make a difference? And probably not.
Okay. Great, thank you very much. I just want to introduce myself. I'm Michael Knapp. I'm the PI on the imaging side for IWOC, and we are serving as IWOC Ohio for SWOG on the imaging side. So first of all, TJ, thank you so much for this wonderful overview and really, again, also highlighting the opportunity that is in front of us, because I think collectively we all see the commitment of the patients, that we generate the data, that we use the data. And I think the only thing I wanted to just add, I think what we are looking for is a more coordination within the network groups and alignment with the stat center, so that we can leverage this amazing infrastructure that is already in place and now built on this, because as TJ pointed out, we got kind of the message, IWOC is a service organization and that's our job. And all the other analysis is much more the responsibility of the network groups. And I think that is where there's a tremendous opportunity for us to align between the RT committee with the imaging committee, kind of with the statistical centers, to then kind of put joint things together. And I think with the clinical trial innovation unit, that all fits extremely well together, that we make this faster, more nimble, and also more data available. So just wanted to say that this has really tremendously evolved, and I think collectively on all behalf of IWOC, as TJ mentioned, we really, in our teams, really want to support those analyses. And we just want to continue to evolve the infrastructure to do this in a more nimble and more timely fashion.
Thank you. All right, so we are kind of running short on time. So I think if anyone has an idea or a question or how to leverage, do they do it through the TCIA mechanism, TJ, or do they do it? Should they email you and your team first, or?
Yeah, I think Michael and I share the same vision, James, that we want to make this happen for everyone. So I think I'm going to take primary responsibility for making this happen. I really feel that that we need to have this information available so that everyone can really evaluate it, publish. These are the apply radiomic tools. So I think in the end, Michael and I will wind up taking large responsibility to get this moving forward, but we probably would welcome everyone's support in that regard. So I think when the opportunity arises, I'll be tapping on all of you for letters of support, things like this, because I just get the impression in talking to the NCI, I need to make this happen through a kind of a different grant process than what's constructed within IROC and also what's constructed with TCIA. In other words, it's going to have to be something that bridges everything together so that all of these tools are available to everyone in a nimble format, and the information's available too. So, but it's something I really want to accomplish for everyone. So,
terrific. All right, thanks, TJ, and you do have our full support, and we look forward to hearing more about it in the future. So, thank you very much. So it is 11:15, so we have 45 minutes to do 9. So that's 5 minutes each. So Dr. Jagsy, are you on?
I am. Hey guys.
Terrific.
Wonderful.
Advance for you.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be with you. Sorry that I'm not there in person. I actually was until last night. And the one little bit, I promise I'll stay within my 5 minutes, but the one bit of really useful information I have for you is that the world's best hot chocolate is just across the street in the ferry terminal, small batch chocolatier called Dandelion Chocolate. For anyone who likes hot chocolate, I strongly recommend grabbing some before you fly back. So with that, let me update you on the open SWOG trials and the ones to come from the breast committee. We had a wonderful presentation at the breast committee that was focused on local regional management, which I think is actually really important, that the SWOG committee that has historically been one dominated by medical oncologists chose to make the focus of the entire committee meeting a series of 3 speakers on local regional management. And really what came out of that was an emphasis on the need for us to have tailored trials for patients at all disease stages. And I think that's really where we're progressing to being within SWOG. So this trial is one of our 2 open trials through the breast committee right now. And it is the phase 2 randomized trial of olaparib concurrently at a radiosensitizing dose with standard radiation therapy versus standard radiation therapy alone for inflammatory breast cancer. Next slide, please. So this is a randomized trial that is randomizing to a goal of 300 patients. We're at 131 right now. We are just a little slow in terms of accrual. And so in order to keep up with projections, we have been asked to do anything that we can to increase the pace of accrual. We can't relax our statistical assumptions any further because we're already being extraordinarily ambitious in the effect size we're trying to detect. So we are going to proceed to allow BID treatment in the standard arm because there are some institutions where twice daily treatment, for example, at MD Anderson is considered to be the standard of care, and by not permitting that, it is making it harder for them to enroll. So that is an amendment that will be put through soon. Next slide. We have 2 trials that are in development, being led by Dr. Connolly and then Dr. Spears. So let me start with Dr. Connolly. Next slide, sorry. Perfect. So this is the phase 2 randomized trial of IORT versus observation for low-risk DCIS in postmenopausal women after they receive lumpectomy. And you will all recall that Eileen has put a ton of work into this concept, and she's now got it to the stage that they have just asked for a pilot trial to determine feasibility. So she's planning to submit a U34 this June, and then commence a pilot trial of 50 patients at 5 in these low risk. Next slide, please. At the effect of aggressiveness is these trials at patients have locally advanced ER positive CDK4/6 inhibition with ribociclib concurrent with radiation. He will be bringing this through SWOG once he completes his 1B at 3 sites very soon, with a hope for the first patient in June. And then we have, next slide, please, 3 open champion trials from other groups that help us to cover the landscape in between low-risk DCIS and locally advanced and inflammatory breast cancer. And those are the MA39 Taylor RT trial, the BR007, and the BR008. So MA39 is positive, favorable biology patients. The conclusion of the S1007 observational analysis of RT use was that we really, really need this trial. It's a randomized trial of regional nodal irradiation in these primarily N1, but now also allowing micromets in T3N0 patients. We don't have a ton of credits we're being assigned, but I really do believe that the SWOG folks, primarily who are medical oncologists, are playing an incredibly important role in introducing this concept to patients early on. Next slide. BR007 is championed by Dean Shumway, and it is the trial for omission of radiation therapy in ER positive favorable biology patients. And it is underway and already has accrued 379 patients. So that's really exciting. Next slide, please. BR008 is being championed by Eileen Connolly, and that has just opened. Super exciting, really innovative trial of omission of radiation therapy in HER2 positive breast cancer, either that is favorable by pathologic features or is favorable in terms of response to neoadjuvant chemotherapy. Next slide. We also have had a number of observational study successes and correlative study successes, and you can see those listed here, and some new concepts that are being pursued, in particular, really groundbreaking work being led by Shane Steckline and colleagues, looking at the optimal management of metastatic disease, oligometastatic disease, and really trying to convert what right now is standard of care, treated with systemic treatment alone into something that's managed more like a locally advanced stage 3 cancer would be paradigm shifting if it works, is going to be biologically tailored, and really is an important step forward, as well as a concept on the conservative management of local regional recurrence, building on the RTOG 1014 trial of radiation that's underway. Next slide. That's it. That's the, I think the last thing is just showing you Shane's, yep. And that is just showing you the current design for the oligometastatic trial that I think is so exciting, that is in progress and being developed through the working group. So we intend to have trials across the entire spectrum of breast cancer, from DCIS to metastatic disease and everything in between, and we are well on our way. Thank you.
Outstanding. Thank you, Dr. Jagsy. And in the interest of time, we'll move on. Tony, are you on?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Terrific. Yep.
Okay, great. I will try to move just as fast as Dr. Jagsy. So I have the pleasure of updating you on CNS updates for trials within SWOG, the CNS working group, as well as trials from other cooperative groups. So first off, I'd just like to highlight this trial. This is the Alliance A071801 trial. This is a phase 3 randomized trial led by Paul Brown from Alliance, randomizing patients to limited brain metastases, one of which has to undergo a gross total resection, to single fraction radiosurgery or fractionated radiosurgery. This trial has closed to accrual several months ago, and we look forward to seeing the actual results. The primary endpoint here is time to surgical bed recurrence, which will help answer us the question on the fractionation and radiosurgical answer. Next slide, please. This is ongoing NRG-BN009 trial led by Mike Chan, Wake Forest, Vinay Gandhi, Northwestern. This is a phase 3 trial of salvage hippocampal avoidance whole brain radiotherapy, radiosurgery versus salvage radiosurgery for patients who have first or second distant brain metastases if they have a brain metastasis velocity of 4 brain mets, greater than 4 brain mets per year. So this trial does need some support. The accrual has not been as robust as some of the other trials. And I just want to highlight the second trial here. Next slide, please. And this is the NRG-BN007 trial. This actually is currently on hold. These are for patients who have newly diagnosed glioblastomas with unmethylated MGMT, randomized to standard temozolomide and radiation therapy, or radiation therapy with concomitant ipilimumab and nivolumab, followed by adjuvant ipi-nivo. And we look forward to seeing the interim results. Next slide, please. This is NRG-BN2224. This is being led by Rupesh at Miami Cancer Institute. This is a concept phase 3 trial of single fraction radiosurgery versus fractionated radiosurgery for intact brain metastases. Next slide, please. And these are for patients with up to 1 to 8 brain metastases, for which their patients are randomized to single fraction radiosurgery of 24 gray to as low as 18 gray in single fraction, or fractionated radiosurgery of 30 gray to 27 gray in 3 fractions. Primary endpoint is 1-year local control. Again, similar to the design of the Alliance A071801 trial, and we look forward to this being activated. Next slide, please. And this is this is NRG, this is not BN 2228 anymore, apologies. This is a study by Stuart Burry in North Carolina that was in concept last time presented this. This is the randomized phase 3 trial of neoadjuvant preoperative radiosurgery versus postoperative radiosurgery in patients with resectable brain metastases. Next slide, please. And so these are patients who have 1 to 4 brain mets, one of which requires resection, that are then randomized to either preoperative radiosurgery, followed by planned resection, or what is pretty commonly postoperative radiosurgery following surgical resection. The primary endpoint here is to assess for local failure, as well as rates of nodular meningeal disease or radiation necrosis from either arms. Next slide, please. This is Alliance A071702 using checkpoint blockade immunotherapy in patients with somatically hypermutated recurrent glioblastomas. Next slide, please. And the trial schema is patients who are found to have, it could be GBM, IDH wild type or mutant, but actually that's probably going to change, who have a first or secondary recurrence and are identified to have hypermutation to undergo stage 1 ipilimumab, of 18 patients. And there's more than one response, then it goes to stage 2. So again, combination Nivo and ipilimumab combination. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned before, the SWOG CNS is a working group. It is not a committee. There are 2 concepts that are being pushed forward. This is a phase 2 study of atezolizumab and tocilizumab with radiotherapy in patients with newly diagnosed MGMT unmethylated glioblastoma. Next slide, please. And so we know that patients with newly diagnosed glioblastomas have, with unmethylated MGMT, have a poor overall survival versus those methylated. And in both the checkpoint as well as NRG-BN007, adjuvant temozolomide was omitted in those studies. And so this is a single arm trial looking at radiation plus atezotosi followed by adjuvant atezotosi. We just had a working group, CNS working group meeting yesterday, and there's plans to potentially randomize that per the committee meetings. And this is the last trial I'll show. This is by Mami Alawalia, who's the head of the CNS working group. This is using TRC-102, which is a base excision repair inhibitor. Next slide, please. Again, in the phase of newly diagnosed GBMs for methylated MGMT. And we're pushing both trials that both favor GBM, both in the unmethylated MGMT arm as well as the unmethylated MGMT cohort. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tony. David, are you on?
Yep, here I am. Next slide. Just have a couple slides. I'll try to keep us on schedule. So we don't have any open trials in the GI group that have a primary radiation question at this point. There are a couple in development, but we're championing several other trials, notably the NRG-GI006, which is a randomized trial of proton versus IMRT for esophageal cancer. Since our last meeting, it's been accruing reasonably, 18 since the last meeting, and the primary endpoints for that one are overall survival and grade 3+ cardiopulmonary toxicity. There's a study from ECOG, the 2183, which I'm championing, which is a phase 3 trial looking at consolidative radiotherapy in patients with oligometastatic esophageal and gastric adenocarcinoma. This study was closed for some time in order to allow for an amendment so that they can give immunotherapy after recent publications. Since it's reopened, it doesn't appear that there have been any patients accrued on this trial. So if this is something that we want to figure out the answer, the role for radiation in these patients, we really have to accrue. The NRG-GI003 is a proton versus photon trial for hepatocellular carcinoma, sort of a successor trial to the RTOG1112 that we heard about at Astro. And this has been, again, accruing reasonably since the fall meeting, but we'd like to see more. And this has a primary endpoint of overall survival. And keeping in the theme of anal cancer trials historically accruing very, very well, the Decrease Anal Cancer trial looking at dose de-escalation for patients with low risk T1 or T2 and 0 anal cancer has accrued 35 since the fall meeting. And this has a disease-free survival and health-related quality of life endpoint. I'd encourage everybody to open these up and accrue. So there's another very interesting radiation-related study that we're championing. The SWOG champion is Sep Golami, who's a surgeon at Northwell. And this is the Erasure trial looking at total ablative therapy for patients with limited metastatic colorectal cancer. And this is the randomization here. Patients get systemic therapy for 16 to 24 weeks and then get randomized to the institutional standard of care or total ablative therapy, which can include SBRT, microwave ablation, or surgical resection, followed by the institutional standard of care therapy. Next slide, please. The primary endpoint for this is overall survival, with secondary endpoints of safety, event-free survival, and time to local recurrence. This is not that large a study. It's 350 patients. Patients have to have oligometastatic disease with 4 or fewer sites of metastasis. And importantly for us in the Radiation Oncology Committee, SBRT is required for at least one of the lesions. The choice of surgery or microwave ablation can occur with multidisciplinary discussion, but SBRT has to be given. And in order to help accrue, the systemic therapy can be given at an outside institution, though the local therapy has to be given at the enrolling institution. Next slide, please. And there's one more study that we're currently developing, strong support from industry as well as from within the GI committee, looking at neoadjuvant and adjuvant immunotherapy for locally advanced high-risk anal cancer using a PD-1 and a LAG-3 inhibitor from Regeneron, 2 cycles pre-chemoradiation and 2 cycles post-chemoradiation with a primary endpoint of 6-month complete response rate. There are a lot of very interesting correlative analyses that we can do on this as well, because these tumors are locally accessible. That's it.
Outstanding, thank you. Oh, this is me. I'm going to be very fast. So most importantly, the study that Leslie Ballas is pushing through is on its way, I think. This is the the PRESERVE trial, where post chemotherapy, if there is clinical T0, T1, they are then registered, and then there's a repeat TURBT. I believe T0, T1 is now allowed as well on the template biopsy, and then subsequently going to radiation plus immunotherapy versus radiation chemotherapy. This is an old slide, that's my fault. But very, very interesting, very exciting for us. Ongoing SWOG trials, this was a huge thing at the meeting. The SWOG 1802, which is looking at surgery or radiation for oligometastatic prostate cancer. The radiation arm is getting very close to capping. And so there was a huge discussion because the surgery patients are not accruing to this study. We are obviously pushing to raise or get rid of the radiation cap, but more work on this is ongoing. But please continue to accrue to this on the radiation arm, and we'll see. Our prediction is probably in a couple of months they'll get rid of the cap, but that's to be seen. SWOG 1806 is a randomized trial of concurrent chemotherapy with or without TIZO. They did the first interim analysis a couple of months ago, and this is going to continue, and likely, as you can see, the accrual numbers are going great. So likely we'll close once it completes accrual. SWOG 1931 is the probe study that was having difficulty accruing, but now is actually improving. This is renal cell with metastatic disease, phase 3 trial of immunotherapy-based combination therapy with or without cytoreductive nephrectomy. Accrual is going well. SWOG 2011, the SWOG GAP trial is having a lot of difficulty accruing, and so there was some discussion today about amendments. SWOG 1937, also not a radiation trial, is eribulin with or without gemcitabine versus standard of care for metastatic urothelial carcinoma. This is also in danger of closing as well. And the champion studies, I think we've all heard about. I'll just go through very quickly. GEO-09 is a very high accruing study out of NRG. Hong Zhang is the SWOG champion. This is for high-risk patients doing a de-intensification or intensification based on Decipher score. Similarly, Dan is the champion for SWOG GU10, which is the guidance study. I think also accruing very well, similar to GEO-09, but for unfavorable intermediate risk disease, using Decipher to stratify and then intensify or de-intensify. Prometheus is GU-11. Bridget Kuntz is the PI. Promethean, this is for oligometastatic disease for prostate cancer. And adding on 6 months of relugolix with SABRE versus blinded placebo, I think a very interesting study. It's having a little slow accrual, so we encourage everyone to try and open this, especially if you're doing a lot of radiosurgery for oligometastatic disease. Endpoint is radiological progression-free survival. Thanks, Henry.
All right, thank you very much. So the lung committee update. So we have 3 trials open currently. One is the Maverick study, 1827, the MRI surveillance plus minus PCI for both limited stage and extensive stage disease. Right now, accruals at about 141 patients. The goal was 600. This, of course, is not going to be likely to happen to get up to 600. So right now, they're working on trying to amend the primary endpoint to cognitive failure-free survival, rather than overall survival, which could bring the numbers down to the 200s, which would be very similar to the other PCI trials that have been out there and have changed practice. So this is something that we need help with limited stage and extensive stage patients. Really, all small cell patients should be considered for this study, as long as they're not progressing on their first line therapy. This is S1914, and this is actually going much better. This was very slow to start. The SBRT plus minus atezo for stage 1s. This is was very slow to start, but then recently has actually has higher accrual than expected. So right now it's 10 per month in recent months, and it was the goal was 8 per month. So this is going very well. There are also 2 competing studies as well ongoing in this space, but still this one is actually very pragmatic. It's only 6 months of IO rather than 12 or 24 months. There's also no placebo arm as well, so patients who are not getting the who are already randomized to getting SBRT don't have to come for infusions. So these patients have to be a little higher risk, that at least 2 centimeters or SUV of 6.2, but it's going much better. S1933 is a smaller study. The target is 47. This is accruing slowly, but 60 gray and 15 fractions, followed by atezo for the borderline performance status patients. The thing I want to note is that actually PS2 only applies to the stage 3 patients. If you happen to have a stage 2 patient, they actually allow for ECOG 1. So that's just the way that goes. And then for the champion studies, LU002, championed by Dan Gomez, is actually still an interim analysis currently. So we'll see how that one goes. But this is for oligometastatic disease in non-small cell lung cancer. LU005, actually, I still have this on the slide because it's closed now in the US. There are still a couple slots left open that are left over in Japan that they're still waiting for. But otherwise, I'm hoping to actually report this out pretty soon. And this was a really success story in the lung cancer world, because they accrued faster than expected, and actually very quickly. And this one is looking at chemo RT plus minus atezo concurrently. LU006, championed by Robbie Samstein. It's accruing pretty slowly, but it's a rare disease, and it's overall 13 patients right now. So after PD for meso, to add IMRT afterwards is the question. LU007 is championed by me, and this one is also accruing slowly but steadily. This is for extensive stage small cell, looking at consolidated thoracic radiation as part of maintenance IO after, so they get chemo IO first, and then they get IO afterwards. Question is whether or not you give SBRT, or just actually not SBRT, low dose radiation to up to 5 sites for consolidation. We just got this open at Yale. So some other sites are just opening this as well. So hopefully this will pick up accrual as well. There is an amendment here that allows for patients to be treated with, it used to be that you couldn't include these patients if they had brain mets, but now you can, but only if they got whole brain radiation. So that's still, not everybody in this case. But this is up to 5 sites, really just 30 gray and 10 fractions for most patients. Should be pretty easy to enroll on, hopefully. And also you can co-enroll on Maverick. So the same patient can go on Maverick and Raptor. And then EA5181 is accruing really well. This is actually almost done. This is going to be done probably within the year. And this is for non-small cell lung cancer stage 3. The question of, do you do Pacific regimen, or do you add do you bring the IO earlier to the concurrent setting? And then Alliance study is accruing slowly but steadily. This is for the PD-L1 negative stage 4 patients who are getting IO or chemo IO. And the question is, do you give kind of lower dose SBRT, 24 gray and 3 fractions? This is our basic summary here. We have something in the early stage space, locally advanced space for borderline resectable, for stage 4 patients, as well as for small cell and meso right now. So we had the lung radiation and surgical subcommittee meeting recently as well. That we have several concepts that are ongoing. I'm going to give you a quick update on mine here. Just go straight to the schema here, which is going to SWOG exec hopefully pretty soon. The capsule's written and has supported the lung disease working group. And this one is, we talked about this at multiple other sessions in the last couple of years. The iteration that we're hoping to go through is to focus on the unresectable patients for now, and then to look at the Pacific regimen versus doing it to move the chemo RT even to move the IO even earlier. So we have support from AZ right now to proceed with this. So the idea is to get ctDNA as well as a biomarker that's exploratory, but to give chemo and durva for 2 to 3 cycles first, and then to give Pacific afterwards is on the experimental arm. So we got the sample size down to 92, so hopefully going to be able to get this through without having to go through steering committee. All right, I'm going to stop there for the sake of moving on. Thank you.
Terrific.
Oh, yes. Lisa, you have a question?
So on your developing trial, was there talk about doing a phase 2/3, especially since Dr. Blanky wants sort of phase 3 trials?
Yes, there was, and actually that would be ideal to go the seamless 2 to 3. That actually we had talked about that before this had come up again, so I think we should readdress that. That's a good point. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Henry. Sandy, are you on? Yeah, that's right. That's right. I'll just go through this quickly. This is the lymphoma committee. Dr. Ha, Dr. Pinnix, Dr. Constantine. The first study he wants to highlight is the phase 3 randomized study of Nivo plus AVD or brentuximab vedotin plus AVD in patients with newly diagnosed advanced stage classical Hodgkin's lymphoma. The study is accruing very well, 855 out of 987. This is a intergroup study, early stage favorable and unfavorable Hodgkin's lymphoma. 2 randomizations depending on PET positivity. I don't know what that red box means. Dr. Ha, feel free to jump in if I miss something. This is the ones that got radiation. Okay, thanks. COG ANHL 1931 randomized phase 3 study evaluating Nivo and upfront PMBCL. It's also intergroup. There's a chemo backbone that's declared by the physician, and the randomization is RCHOP or DA-EPOCH-R versus the addition of Nivo. Great. Did I miss anything? Yep. I think he had a conflict. So, okay.
The first slide you showed, that's going to be the plenary presentation at ASCO this year.
So Dr. Haas said this slide is going to be the plenary. Terrific. So this is going to be, everyone look out for that at ASCO. Thanks. Evan, are you on?
Yes.
All right, go
Thanks,
for it.
everybody. I'll give an update of the melanoma committee. Next slide, please. So one of the studies that, if you haven't heard about this, it was just recently published in SWOG 1801, which basically showed that neoadjuvant immunotherapy is even more effective than adjuvant immunotherapy in patients that have stage 3 disease. And so this is really going to change the management of stage 3, clinically detected nodal basin melanoma pretty substantially. And so I think the future clinical trials are going to build off of a neoadjuvant immunotherapy backbone as opposed to surgery up front. So local therapy like surgery and radiation keep getting pushed further and further away from diagnosis in this disease. But there are still some opportunities to study local therapies, which we can talk about. All right, next slide, thanks. This is just for reference. This is the current, clinical trial landscape in melanoma. They're looking at combinations of MAP kinase pathway inhibitors with immunotherapy in melanoma, also looking at other immunotherapy agents, so like LAG-3 inhibitors and other agents that stimulate immune response. Next slide. None of those studies that are currently active in the NCTN in the melanoma space really involve radiation therapy directly. This study just completed accrual. This was the Merkel cell carcinoma stage 2 and 3 trial looking at adjuvant pembrolizumab. And so it just completed. It had a very robust, total, probably the, I don't know, probably the single largest Merkel cell carcinoma trial, at least that I know of. And so it was a standard of care after surgery and radiation versus adding adjuvant pembrolizumab. So it'll be really exciting to see the results of this and find out whether immunotherapy helps patients in this stage of disease. And then the obvious next question after that will be, well, if immunotherapy is helpful in the adjuvant setting, should it also be in the neoadjuvant setting like melanoma? Next slide. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on 1801 just so you know about it, because it's really, pretty practice changing. Randomization 1-to-1 between neoadjuvant immunotherapy versus surgery, followed by adjuvant anti-PD-1. Next slide. This looked at event-free survival, and events were either progression or toxicity that rendered the study participant unable to receive surgery. So that would have been an event. Failure to begin adjuvant therapy within 84 days of surgery, so a rough time after surgery. Melanoma recurrence after surgery, or death from any cause. Next slide. And you can see that using that event-free survival metric, neoadjuvant immunotherapy has a 2-year event-free survival at 72%, whereas adjuvant was 50%. And this was highly statistically significant. And having just been involved in tumor board and stuff with a fair number of patients on this study, it was becoming apparent towards the end of the study that the people with the neoadjuvant therapy were doing better, even just if you didn't even, just anecdotally almost. And this is not yet a statistically significant survival difference, but you can see that there is a potential hint, although there's a lot of censoring of data, that this may even go into an overall survival benefit. But we'll see as the data matures and more people get to that 2- and 3-year out to really assess that. Next slide. Go ahead with the next slide. If you could advance the next slide, please.
Yep, we're advancing.
Oh, it's really slow on my end. Sorry. Okay, yeah. And this, what was also interesting about this is it seems to be true regardless of all different kinds of patients. So old patients, young patients, people doing awesome, people not doing so well as does not seem to matter as far as BRAF status goes. So that's kind of interesting. What I wanted to emphasize in this plot is maybe a potential for clinical trial ideas, since neoadjuvant immunotherapy is going to be the upfront, treatment for patients with a lot of stage 3 melanomas. There still are a substantial group of people who have less than a complete or partial response. So you're still seeing that a large percentage here on this waterfall plot have either stable disease or progression of disease on immunotherapy. And so maybe the question for these patients is, should they have escalation of their immunotherapy, a dual agent, an ipi-nivo or a nivo-rela regimen, or should they have that in addition to a regional course of radiation therapy? So that might be a fruitful place for future clinical trials that have to do with radiation therapy and melanoma. Next slide, please. Yeah, sorry, it sounds like the slide advancement's lagging a little bit on the online thing. So this is just a summary of this trial, but basically event-free survival significantly better in the neoadjuvant arm compared to the adjuvant arm. No safety signals, and we'll find out more about overall survival as we go along. Next slide. In previous updates, we talked about how we were doing a secondary analysis of SWOG 1404 to look at the role of adjuvant regional nodal radiation, and that project continues to move along sort of slowly but surely. The manuscript's written, needs to be revised and submitted, so that project's going along. Next slide. The other thing that's going on in the skin cancer trial space is that the NCI had a clinical trial planning meeting that has occurred over the past year and culminated in a face-to-face meeting in January, looking at cutaneous squamous cell carcinomas and immunocompromised and immunosuppressed patient population. So that spurred 3 or 4 or 4 or 5 actually really good ideas for patient populations like this for the cooperative groups potentially to pick up. So we expect that this may yield some good clinical trials to the NCTN mechanism in this population in the coming year. So also the NRG Oncology now has a head their head and neck group now has a skin cancer subcommittee, which may take some of these trials some of their own. So there may be some increased work, some increased number of NCTN trials having to do with cutaneous squamous cell carcinoma. That's all. Happy to take your questions, and thanks for the opportunity to present.
Yep, Dr. Kachnik has a question, Evan.
I was going to ask, great presentation on the opportunity for not complete responses to the immunotherapy for radiation. So thanks for raising that question. Is there preclinical data that in this setting, radiation helps to rev up the immune system, like does something to the Tregs and makes it again amenable to checkpoint inhibitors?
Yeah, there does seem to be. It's a little bit conflicting though. So you'll see some preclinical studies that are positive for radiation therapy. In this thing, you'll see some that are.
Oh well. Anyone by
We lost your audio there, Evan.
Well, I guess it's an opportunity for us to start thinking about that as a trial.
Right. Yeah. So great point. Yep. Thanks, Evan. Dr. Cook, are you on?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great.
Okay, so this will be really quick because there's really only one study in either of the 2 committees that has anything to do with radiation, but I just summarized what some of the active and in development studies are. So for Symptom Control Quality of Life Committee, here are the active studies. Mostly, systemic therapy focused, things like immune enhancing nutrition on radical cystectomy outcomes, a phase 3 trial comparing active symptom monitoring plus patient education versus patient education alone to help women with breast cancer improve persistence with endocrine therapy. There's this long-running iCheck-It trial that's just looking at toxicity associated with immune checkpoint inhibitors, and then a trial looking at limb compression for the prevention of peripheral neuropathy. Next slide. They have the one study that's in development that's looking at probiotics to be used in patients who are getting pelvic radiation. So that one was presented at this meeting and is in development and will probably need some of our input. There's also a presentation about cognitive rehabilitation intervention for cancer-related cognitive impairment, as well as acupuncture for symptom management in patients with metastatic breast cancer. Next slide. In the survivorship committee, there were a few others. I think these were all open in the last time I presented to in the fall. So Varvatalol in prevention of cardiac toxicity, perioperative physical activity intervention, glucose monitoring to improve glycemic safety in pediatric patients with ALL, a study looking at protecting ovarian reserve in young patients with cancer to improve fertility, and then a study looking at predictors of cachexia in cancer patients. Next slide. And then there's just one presentation on a proposal for a behavioral sleep intervention in patients living with metastatic cancer. That's all I got.
Great, thanks, Dr. Cook. Yeah, the symposium for the GU symposium, the Vogelzang symposium was on microbiome, was really terrific. Encourage everyone to watch it if it's recorded. Dr. Connolly?
Yes, yeah, I'm here. Okay, so next slide, please. So similarly with prevention and cancer care delivery, there are no active studies that involve radiation, but I summarized the open studies and the trials in development. So for the prevention committee, SWOG is going to be closing in June. This is a prevention trial for development of colorectal cancer in high-risk patients with adenomas. They expect a complete accrual at the end of June and should report outcomes pretty quickly since the outcome is measured with the repeat colonoscopy. And then S1823 is an observational cohort looking at a biomarker for risk of recurrence in testicular cancer. And this is also occurring very quickly and should probably close within the next year, looking at MIR 371. And then S1904 is a cluster randomized trial of patients and provider decision support, looking at chemoprevention decision-making, and has been open for about a year and a half and is occurring well. In development, you've already heard about my study, which is a randomized trial of IRT versus surgery alone for low-risk DCIS, which I'm going to be submitting a U34 in June. And then there's a new concept that was just triage approved. It's 2311, I believe, which is looking at low-dose exemestane or tamoxifen in prevention of atypical hyperplasia, lobular in situ, or DCIS in postmenopausal women. Next. So next slide, please. So in cancer care delivery, there's 3 active studies. One is looking at financial hardship through proactive financial navigation intervention, the credit trial. This is looking at patient spouse dyads and looking at addressing financial toxicity. This is occurring slowly and they are going to make some modifications. 2108 is a randomized, this is an interesting study that's been open just for a year, but is occurring very quickly at the NCORP sites. It's actually a randomization of the NCORP sites to include education, create genomic tumor boards for the providers to help with patient care. And then there's 1703, which is a randomized non-inferiority trial of survival in metastatic hormone positive. So basically looking at tumor markers in metastatic HER2 positive breast cancer. And this is accruing well, and it's been active since 2018. In terms of development, there's multi-level intervention to promote guideline concordant colorectal surveillance, as well as a patient-centered video education intervention to improve rural center care delivery. So nothing directly radiation related, but if you have ideas in these spaces, a good place to go. So that's it.
Great, thanks, Dr. Connolly. And it looks like we are done. I'm going to read Evan's response to Dr. Kachnik's question. There is some preclinical data that looks good and seems that perhaps Tregs are less prevalent after RT, but the data seems a little mixed. Another pathway would be using the RT upfront in macroscopic stage 3 melanoma to try to get a higher response rate than neoadjuvant immunotherapy alone. So thanks, Dr. Wetherick, for that. And we are done. Does anyone have any last questions, any last words, Dr. Kachnik? Nope. All right, we'll see you guys all in Chicago in person and on the Zooms, the monthly calls. Thanks.